Imagine a dam holding back a massive river. The water level represents population density, rising and falling over time. Below the dam lies the landscape of human civilization, economies, infrastructure, governance, technology, cultural institutions, and the environment itself. When the water level is balanced, the system functions smoothly, generating energy, irrigating fields, and sustaining life. But when the pressure builds too high, the dam creaks under the strain. If an outlet exists, like controlled water release, balance can be restored. But if that release is blocked, the dam eventually fails, unleashing catastrophic floods that reshape the entire terrain. That's what's happening to our world right now. For centuries, humanity's population surged, filling cities, expanding economies, and pushing technological frontiers. Immigration and emigration have always been the floodgates, redistributing people to relieve pressure in overburdened areas and repopulate declining ones. But today, those floodgates are slamming shut. Rising anti-immigration sentiment and restrictive policies around the world are trapping populations in place, forcing balance to be restored through harsher, more destructive means: falling birth rates, rising death rates, and systemic breakdowns. This isn't just about migration policy. This is about the fundamental self-regulation of human civilization. Population density acts as an invisible governor, keeping activity levels in optimal balance with available resources. When density gets too high, pressures emerge: overcrowded hospitals, traffic gridlock, environmental degradation, crime spikes. When density gets too low, stagnation sets in: labor shortages, failing infrastructure, economic collapse. Normally, people move to where conditions are better, smoothing out imbalances. But when that natural release is blocked, pressures don't disappear. They concentrate, forcing other regulatory mechanisms to compensate. Every major system in society, our economies, governments, infrastructure, innovation hubs, social structures, and ecosystems, relies on this balance. When population density is misaligned with these systems, feedback loops emerge. The more misaligned it becomes, the more severe those feedbacks grow, until the system must correct itself, sometimes violently. If people can't redistribute, the only remaining options are birth rates plummeting, mortality rising, or both. Today we'll examine how population density regulates these core systems, how those systems regulate density in return, and how removing emigration as a pressure release mechanism accelerates instability. We'll explore the patterns that emerge, how an overburdened economy dampens fertility, how failing infrastructure exacerbates mortality, how governance crumbles under demographic pressure, how innovation stalls in stagnation, how social cohesion fractures, and how environmental limits become unavoidable. The key lesson: nature will always seek balance, whether we plan for it or not. If we close off the natural ways to regulate population pressures, we invite far more brutal corrections in their place. Economic development is often the most conspicuous layer of societal health. Employment provides livelihoods, energy consumption reflects industrial and residential demand, and freight volume signifies the movement of goods, a proxy for commercial vibrancy. In an ideal setting, population density aligns with these three elements, creating a balanced state. Businesses have enough workers to sustain productivity, energy infrastructure meets a predictable demand, and transport networks efficiently move materials without excessive congestion or underutilization. However, the real world seldom remains in such a steady state for long. Over time, an uptick in population density, driven by higher birth rates or immigration, can fuel economic booms, spurring investment in new factories, expansions of the power grid, and improved logistics. People flock to regions where they sense economic promise, compounding the growth cycle. Initially, this can be beneficial. More workers fill job vacancies, more consumers bolster markets, and shipping networks adapt to serve increasing demand. Yet, at a certain point, the influx outpaces infrastructural capacity. Overstrained grids lead to blackouts, freight bottlenecks delay deliveries, and job markets can't accommodate everyone. The cost of living rises as competition for resources intensifies, and the quality of life may decline despite apparent economic gains. Now consider what happens if the usual release valve, emigration, no longer functions. When people can't or won't move elsewhere due to anti-immigration measures worldwide or border closures, the feedback loop that normally disperses stress across regions breaks. The local population must then self-correct more severely. Birth rates dip because families face mounting financial pressure or delayed childbearing in a climate of scarce opportunity. Over time, mortality may also climb if economic pressures translate into reduced healthcare access or malnutrition. These dynamics signal a harsh, self-regulatory mechanism at work. Without the possibility of relocation, density relies on potentially dire internal corrections to reach equilibrium. This leads to stagnation or contraction in the job market, and ironically, energy consumption may drop as people cut back or as companies fail. Freight volume can also suffer from a lack of purchasing power and declining commercial activity. Hence, in the absence of emigration, economic development doesn't simply plateau. It warps in on itself, forcing a gradual or abrupt realignment that might have been less painful had population outflow remained an option. The lesson is that population density is neither all good nor all bad. It's a finely tuned dial. Disabling the dial's freedom to move, by eliminating immigration and emigration options, can turn a healthy economic engine into a risky, high-stakes balancing act with no quick exit. Infrastructure underpins everyday life, from roads and transit systems to water pipes and treatment facilities. Ideally, these networks should match population density to deliver services efficiently, neither wasted on a too small user base nor overloaded by an excessive one. Roadway length, for instance, is built with an anticipated traffic volume in mind. Public transit ridership is forecasted to ensure profitable routes and reliable schedules. Municipal water supply capacity is calculated based on local consumption patterns, plus a safety margin for unexpected surges or drought conditions. When population density rises in a healthy manner, municipalities can plan incremental expansions, widening roads, adding transit lines, and drilling new wells or building reservoirs. At the same time, increased population means broader tax revenues to fund improvements, thus maintaining quality service. This is the proverbial sweet spot where demand meets supply in a sustainable cycle. Problems start when density grows faster than infrastructure can be upgraded. Crowded roads become perpetual bottlenecks, public transit is standing room only, and even that feels luxurious at rush hour, and water rationing becomes the norm. Deteriorating infrastructure then feeds on itself. Frustration with congestion and resource scarcity can trigger local decline as quality of life plummets. Ordinarily, emigration balances these pressures. People living in severely congested cities might relocate to suburbs or smaller towns, easing demand on infrastructure while stimulating development elsewhere. This geographic diffusion can prevent total system breakdown, albeit sometimes at the cost of urban flight. Now remove that outlet, either because global anti-immigration sentiment discourages movement or internal policies limit relocation. The effect is an intensification of local burdens. With nowhere to go, or nowhere that's measurably better, residents remain in place. Overwhelmed municipalities face a vicious cycle. Tax revenue may rise initially with a larger population, but it's devoured by emergency repairs or expansions that never quite catch up. Public disillusionment sets in, often fueling political tension that further undermines coordinated infrastructure planning. Water supply is particularly vulnerable in this scenario. As population density escalates without the ability to disperse, regional aquifers and reservoirs face increased extraction. Overuse triggers a higher cost for water treatment and distribution, which in turn elevates living expenses. If birth rates remain stable despite these issues, the strain intensifies. If they drop, the aging or stagnant population cannot fund large-scale upgrades. Each outcome erodes public confidence in municipal planning. Ultimately, the forced reliance on birth and death rate adjustments, rather than the mobility of a workforce, pushes infrastructure systems into a precarious balance that is easily toppled by environmental shocks or political shifts. Governance is the glue that holds social institutions together. In an ideal scenario, a region's population density generates enough tax revenue to fund law enforcement and healthcare, ensuring safety and public well-being. The interplay is cyclical, stable governance and well-funded services attract businesses and individuals, bolstering the tax base further, which in turn strengthens societal pillars. However, population density can undermine governance when it grows unchecked or contracts too sharply. Rapid increases in density, for instance, place sudden demands on public coffers. More law enforcement personnel are needed to maintain order, especially in dense urban areas prone to higher crime rates. Healthcare facilities can become inundated, requiring budget expansions. If tax revenue lags behind demographic realities, governments face budget shortfalls, leading to austerity or cuts in essential services. Trust in public institutions can deteriorate quickly under these strains. Likewise, a collapsing population, a scenario featuring widespread outmigration or low birth rates, can starve a government of the revenue it needs to maintain infrastructure, law enforcement, and healthcare, resulting in hollowed-out communities with skeletal services. Typically, emigration helps recalibrate these extremes. Overpopulated regions see outflows that ease pressure on housing, schools, and policing. Underpopulated areas may attract new arrivals seeking opportunity or a quieter lifestyle, raising tax revenue and revitalizing local institutions. But in a world with rising anti-immigration sentiment, this outlet is constricted. People face fewer legal pathways to move abroad or even between regions. Consequently, localized imbalances become more pronounced. A city that cannot cope with ballooning public healthcare demands doesn't see a natural departure of citizens to less congested municipalities. Instead, the same population must endure the degraded service or pay for private alternatives, if they can afford it. On the flip side, rural or declining areas don't enjoy the typical infusion of new residents to bolster tax revenue. Birth rates alone rarely compensate for lost population, especially when families feel uncertain about economic prospects. An aging demographic might increase healthcare costs without expanding the tax base to fund them. Governmental responses can include heavier taxation, but this risks fueling public discontent in regions where wages are already low or job markets are unstable. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies may struggle to recruit in areas deemed unattractive, leading to rising crime or under-policing. The spiral can become self-perpetuating. Discontent with government performance erodes willingness to pay taxes or abide by new policies. Polarization grows, and political stability wanes, making it even more difficult to address root causes. Hence, shutting down emigration as a mechanism for population balancing doesn't just impact demographics, it fundamentally shakes the pillars of governance, forcing a more severe rebalancing via economics and mortality. Without the ability to spread out and mitigate local resource constraints, the social contract is tested at every turn. Technology and innovation thrive on a certain density of talent and collaboration. A rich ecosystem of researchers, entrepreneurs, and skilled workers often gravitates to urban innovation clusters. Think Silicon Valley, Shenzhen, or Bengaluru. These hubs are magnets for global migration, with ambitious individuals drawn to the promise of advanced research facilities, startup incubators, and venture capital. The electrical grid load and data traffic in these regions reflect the intense usage by businesses and residents. Likewise, patent filings surge as more creative minds gather in proximity. This density can yield extraordinary leaps in tech development, fueling new industries and reshaping entire economies. Yet, unmitigated growth can invert into an innovation bottleneck. As population density explodes, the cost of living skyrockets, infrastructure sags, and competition for funding becomes fierce. Even the brightest minds may find that chronic congestion, both literal and figurative, throttles creativity. Grid capacity is strained, brownouts disrupt manufacturing or critical data centers, hindering progress. Data networks become congested, slowing digital collaboration. Patent offices backlogged with near-duplicate ideas can delay time-sensitive breakthroughs. Emigration traditionally offers a balanced talent and capital flow outward to emerging tech hubs. dispersing innovation capacity and relieving grid and network pressure in the primary centers. But suppose global policy decisions diminish the appeal or feasibility of relocating. Strict visa requirements, economic nationalism, or heightened skepticism toward foreign tech workers. Instead of an orderly outflow that seeds new clusters, the local density just keeps climbing. Corporations might downsize or move operations elsewhere secretly, but the workforce itself is stuck. That leads to a kind of internal stagnation. Innovation no longer accelerates because the environment is too clogged to pivot quickly. Data traffic remains high, but so does latency. The patent system, choking on repeated ideas, becomes less about fueling genuine breakthroughs and more about defensive filings. In parallel, birth and death rates become the default governors. High costs could discourage new families, eventually thinning the population that once fueled innovation. If living conditions deteriorate severely or, in extreme cases, resource competition spawns civil unrest, mortality could spike. Both outcomes cut deeply into the talent pool. For technology-driven societies that rely on fresh minds and robust collaboration, this scenario is doubly damaging. It curtails the natural innovation diaspora that would otherwise spread know-how across regions, reinforcing the resilience of global tech ecosystems. Instead, the inhibited movement of people undermines one of innovation's greatest advantages, its ability to transgress borders, both literal and conceptual. Societies are more than their economies or technologies. They are communities composed of cultural traditions, social norms, and shared institutions. School enrollment levels reflect the educational backbone supporting future generations. Hospital admissions can signal both the health challenges and the capacity of the system to address them. Crime incidents measure societal well-being from a public safety perspective. These three factors, though seemingly distinct, converge through population density. Dense populations often boast thriving cultures, diverse school systems, and specialized healthcare services. Yet overcrowding can lead to diluted educational resources, too many students per teacher, aging facilities overrun by demand. Hospitals become congested, pushing wait times up and healthcare quality down, while small conditions that could be easily managed in a balanced system turn critical. Heightened density can also correlate with increased crime rates, especially when law enforcement, community programs, and social support structures can't scale rapidly enough. Ordinarily, people disillusioned with high crime rates or subpar schools might leave for communities with fewer social tensions. This mobility fosters a slow leveling effect, where regions that successfully reduce crime or enhance schools attract residents. But amid global or national anti-immigration policies, even internal migration may be stifled, either by bureaucratic hurdles, economic restrictions, or social backlash against perceived outsiders. Without that outlet, families remain in overcrowded districts, and children experience diminished educational outcomes. Healthcare systems buckle, and the sense of communal safety erodes. Over time, birth rates dip in these areas as parents question whether they can provide for their children's well-being. Meanwhile, as social unrest rises from poor conditions, crime can climb further, triggering additional stress on hospitals and an exodus of qualified teachers and healthcare professionals who feel overworked or unsafe. The result is a vicious feedback loop. The same population that can't easily leave is trapped in deteriorating conditions, amplifying each negative indicator. Mortality rates escalate, whether from crime, untreated illnesses, or general decline in public health. Hence, with emigration removed, the cultural fabric frays under relentless strain. Communities that could have preserved or rediscovered balance through relocation must seek it by adjusting fertility rates or by enduring higher death rates. Neither path is gentle on societal resilience. In extreme cases, entrenched crime, shuttered schools, and overburdened hospitals can dismantle decades of cultural heritage and community bonds, leaving a fragmented landscape ill-equipped to regenerate when the crisis subsides. At the heart of every society's survival is the environment, both the resources we draw upon and the waste we produce. Population density is a major determinant of how intensively we interact with our environment. Municipal solid waste surges when large groups consume resources at a high rate, and landfills strain to keep up or pollute surrounding communities. Freshwater withdrawal rises in tandem with population and industry needs, putting rivers, aquifers, and lakes under pressure. Industrial emissions also climb with production, directly impacting air quality and contributing to global climate shifts. When population density increases thoughtfully, aligned with sustainable practices, waste management, water stewardship, and emissions control can remain within manageable thresholds. Recycling programs scale up effectively. Water use is moderated by technology, like efficient irrigation or desalination in coastal areas, and industrial processes employ cleaner energy sources. However, the destructive capacity of an unbalanced density is immense. Improperly managed waste contaminates soil and groundwater, excessive water withdrawal depletes critical reserves, and heavy industry swells greenhouse gas emissions. In typical circumstances, migration can mitigate environmental stress. Regions hit hardest by pollution may see an exodus of residents, lowering pressure on local ecosystems. This movement also redistributes populations to areas with more carrying capacity, potentially buying time for restoration. Yet, if global anti-immigration sentiment or strict domestic zoning prevents relocation, everyone is stuck. Overcrowded regions experience runaway pollution and resource depletion. Vast swaths of natural habitats become degraded, fueling public health crises. If climate change worsens disasters like floods, droughts, or wildfires, the population's inability to disperse intensifies the threat to human life and biodiversity. Under these conditions, the environment becomes a brutal enforcer of equilibrium. Birth rates typically decline as resource insecurity and cost of living burdens escalate. In cases where contamination or climate-induced disasters intensify, death rates spike. Ironically, this grim mechanism can temporarily relieve environmental pressure, albeit at a tragic human cost. Meanwhile, sustainable development efforts struggle against the tide of immediate crisis. Governments might attempt regulatory fixes, tightened emissions standards, or water rationing, but these often require extensive coordination and public trust, both of which fray under duress. With no escape valve, environmental tipping points become all too real. Regions could become uninhabitable, forcing last-ditch migrations in defiance of official policy or borders. In the worst scenarios, communities collapse altogether. Thus, by constraining emigration and ignoring the environment's finite capacity, societies set the stage for a far more painful reckoning. The overarching message is clear. Population density is not an isolated number. It is a dynamic signal of how well or poorly we balance our social, economic, and environmental obligations. When that balance is lost and avenues for relief are blocked, nature and human systems alike respond with uncompromising force. At the heart of the complex interplay between population density and the 6 systems we've examined lies a simple truth. Balance is not achieved by focusing on individual components, but by understanding how emergent states exert pressure on one another at higher levels. Population density is not just the sum of births, deaths, and migrations, nor are our societal systems merely the sum of their measurable parts. Instead, each system interacts with the others in ways that ripple outward, creating feedback loops that regulate density and vice versa. Take technology, for example. A breakthrough in renewable energy might alleviate environmental strain, reducing emissions or water use. This, in turn, changes the environmental pressure on the population side, possibly slowing the pace of rising death rates or reducing migration incentives. But this easing of pressure does not happen in isolation. It affects governance by lowering healthcare demands linked to pollution and infrastructure by reducing strain on aging grids. The interaction of these pressures reshapes the balance, and if emigration is constrained, that reshaping happens more abruptly and painfully. The critical insight is this: population density and societal systems interact at a higher level, beyond the individual components of either. The tension between them doesn't vanish when migration is allowed. It is simply distributed more evenly. Migration can alleviate local crises by redistributing pressures, making the resulting adjustments more gradual and less catastrophic. However, migration cannot eliminate the underlying forces that demand balance. Whether population density grows or shrinks, it must eventually align with the carrying capacity of its supporting systems, economically, environmentally, and socially. This leads us to a deeper challenge, the cultural obsession with perpetual growth. For too long, we've equated rising population numbers with prosperity and falling birth rates with failure. But this mindset ignores the reality that balance, not endless expansion, is the foundation of resilience. Declining birth rates may be a signal that pressures are too great and that a recalibration is underway. Fighting that natural correction, whether through panic-driven pro-natalist policies or rigid opposition to migration, only magnifies the eventual reckoning. We need to embrace a more nuanced understanding of equilibrium. A declining population, managed thoughtfully, could mean less strain on environmental systems, healthier cities, and more sustainable economies. Similarly, open migration pathways allow us to spread pressures across regions, giving societies time to adjust rather than collapsing under localized stress. But these are tools, not solutions. They don't eliminate the need to rethink how we structure our systems to prioritize long-term balance over short-term growth. The future won't be defined by how much we grow, but by how well we adapt. By shifting our focus from expansion to equilibrium, embracing the natural rhythms of population density and systemic regulation, we can create societies that thrive not in spite of change, but because of it.